From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
I just snuck in the studio here for a second because I want to announce we have a guest host this week. Everybody loves a guest host, and everybody loves Emily Carlson. She is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Horticulture at Oregon State University. Many of you remember she had this great show that she hosted with Dr. Christina Grosinger. She's going to go across the Atlantic today, and she's got a great interview lined up for you. So let me make myself scarce and get out of the studio and hand things over to Emily Carlson this week on Pollination.
In any environment with enough flowers, be it a natural area or your garden or even a crop pollination environment, you're likely to see dozens of species of bee flying from flower to flower, collecting pollen and nectar to provision their nests. But have you ever wondered how these different species of bee might be interacting with each other? This week on Pollination, we're taking the podcast all the way to the Laboratory of Apiculture and Social Insects, which is based out of the University of Sussex in Brighton in the southeastern United Kingdom. We'll be speaking with Veronica Wignall, a PhD researcher there who has been exploring some big questions related to insect conservation. How do we improve floral resources for pollinators? And also, how do we investigate resource competition between those pollinators? Are bees and other insects competing for floral rewards? Stay tuned this week on Pollination for our conversation with Veronica. Veronica, your recent work deals with competition between social and solitary bees. Can you explain a bit more about what exploitative competition is and why it's an important concept for ecologists?
Yeah, of course. So exploitative competition is also called resource competition. And it's unlike the competition we normally think of where there's like fights over food. You can imagine like a lion and a hyena fighting over some food. Bees and insects are pretty peaceful when it comes to that kind of thing. So they compete indirectly, and exploitative competition is a version of competition where a shared and finite resource is depleted by one competitor, which means that there's less of it available for the next one. So if you picture a bee foraging on a flower, it takes some nectar out of the flower. The next bee visiting that flower finds that there's less nectar there for it to extract. So essentially they're undergoing an indirect form of competition, and that's what my research has been about.
So essentially you're saying that the solitary bees and the social bees might be competing even though they're not actually fighting. We might not see them going at each other after this resource, but there's competition taking place that's like kind of more subtle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really difficult to, it's quite difficult to spot it happening, but it's happening all the time, which I suppose we'll come on to when we start talking about my experimental methods. But yeah, not necessarily just social bees competing with solitary bees, but also bees within the same species competing with each other. Because for example, if we take honeybees, if a honeybee is visiting a flower, extracting the nectar and pollen, and then the next visitor to that flower is also a honeybee, which is quite likely since they recruit each other to the same flower species, again, you'll have less resource. And it's important for ecologists and also for conservation because flowers are a limited resource. They produce minute quantities of nectar and pollen. And in the UK, at least, quite often there's not that many flowers around at certain times of the year. So you can find there's a situation where there's a shared resource shared amongst lots of foraging taxa that is not super abundant. So you can get some competition, which is probably shaping foraging communities to an extent that we might not realize.
Okay, so that that leads perfectly into our next question, which is, one of the innovative and interesting things about your work is that you've experimentally manipulated this competition. So can you explain a little bit more about that and like what you found that was interesting?
Yeah, of course. So I suppose in that as well is the why. So why did we do that? And that goes back to what I was saying before, which is that you might look at a foraging community of insects and not recognize or not be able to see these competitive interactions that are happening because they're indirect, like we were talking about. So you might see a bumblebee foraging on a patch of lavender and think, oh, bumblebees like lavender, and not really think, could there be other bees that would be foraging there or other insects that would be foraging there potentially if the bumblebee wasn't there. So what we do in our research in my lab, and what I've done follows on from work by Nick Balfour, who I worked with, is we remove those competitors and see what happens. So we've removed, particularly focusing on eusocial bees, since they tend to be quite intense resource users. Like honeybees and bumblebees live in colonies. They need a lot of nectar and pollen. So we did an experimental method we call experimental or manual exclusion. And we physically removed certain bee types from patches of flowers. And we had control patches of flowers where we didn't remove any bees. And we looked to see if there was any difference, firstly in the nectar content of the flowers, and secondarily in what types of bees and how many bees or other insects visited those flowers compared to the control patches.
So you have to tell me more about the manual exclusion. So how do you keep bees off of flowers? Like, what did you do to prevent them from entering that environment?
This is always something I really enjoyed talking about at conferences and things, because we literally tap them all day.
You tap them?
Yeah. So if you are monitoring a patch of flowers, and it's a really labor intensive form of experiment, so I always have a really, really good team of research assistants, and we're out in the field all day during the foraging day. So we'll be there from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. Using a bamboo cane. And if you gently tap a bee foraging on a flower, it flies away. So we'll have a patch where any honeybee approaching that patch, you'll kind of have your eye on it. And as soon as it lands or before it lands, you give it a little tap and it will fly away.
Cool. So you and your team are essentially standing in front of these patches of flowers, like wielding bamboo canes, preventing the bees from landing on it in order to kind of stimulate this exclusion, in order to get the bees to leave the area and be like, oh, exactly. I don't like that. Yeah. I don't like being tapped.
So without trying to affect it too much. So we're trying not to like loom over the patch, because you don't want to affect anything else that might want to come. Although having said that, that never seems to bother bees, right? They never really mind if you're there. They're on a mission. They'll ignore you. But if you gently tap those bees that you don't want foraging in a certain patch, then it seems like a really good method. It reduces those bees to almost zero. And then we've had a really good success with it. It does sound kind of crazy. I read a paper recently where someone had done a similar thing, but they'd used a kind of little jet stream where they blew some air at the bees to remove them.
That's awesome. Well, that's something I, haven't thought too much about, is using either puffs of air or bamboo canes in order to exclude bees from foraging. So I think that's really innovative. So you mentioned a little bit about what you found. Can you give a little more detail about that? Like, so looking at these different, so your setup of the design, if I understand correctly, was you had one patch of flowers where you were excluding bumblebees, and one patch of flowers where you're excluding honeybees, and then one patch of flowers where you didn't do anything, right?
Exactly.
Great. So can you tell us a little bit about what you saw that was different between those patches of flowers?
Sure. So in this experiment, we were actually looking at how competition varies over the whole foraging season. So we'd previously shown that this does have an effect, so I'll talk through that first. So if you, on this particular flower we were using, which was lavender, there's a long corolla tube, and the nectar's right at the base of the corolla tube, so right at the base of the flower. And that gives a bee with a longer tongue a competitive advantage. So this comes back to what I was saying before, where if you saw some bumblebees foraging on some lavender, you'd think, oh, bumblebees really like lavender. And you might not think, or you might think also, oh, honeybees maybe don't like lavender so much. because there's loads of honeybees around here. I can see them on the ivy, I can see them on whatever else, but they're not on this patch of flowers. But actually, previous work by Nick showed that if you tap away the bumblebees over a sustained period of time, what happens is that since they're not taking the nectar with their long tongues, the nectar builds up to an extent where the honeybees can forage on those flowers and then can also make an energetic profit. So it shows this, what we call that is ecological release from competition. So when the dominant competitor, the bumblebees, long-tongued bumblebees, aren't there, it becomes energetically profitable for the honeybee to forage. So it's shown that they would be there if this other competitor wasn't present, basically. So
just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so is it that basically the nectar never in the lavender never has a chance to build up to the point where the honeybee doesn't have to work super hard in order to get it, right? Because it's being constantly drained by the bumblebee.
So that's the situation with this particular flower, and mechanisms of competition work differently on different flower types. But with this particular one, that was the mechanism, the underlying mechanism that we found was going on. Yeah. And it is quite sweet because if you're watching the flowers, you see a bumblebee and they're just like bam, 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 flower, flower, flower. And they're just so quick and efficient at extracting the nectar. And if you see the honeybee, it really has to kind of burrow its whole head into the flower to try and get anything out of it. So you can see it happening kind of with your own eyes if you have time to stop and look. But yeah, then so what we then did is we repeated this experiment with the 3 patches, like you said, and we did it from May until September. Each trial we did was 4 days long. So we had a good amount of time to see what was going on. And what we wanted to see was, are there times of year when competition is particularly strong? And are there times of year where insects could be compensated for by the fact that competition is less strong? And this brings us to an idea of per insect resource availability. So you might have plenty of flowers out there, but you might also have loads of insects, or you might have not many flowers but not many insects, in which case competition is low. But if you have not many flowers and plenty of insects, there's less food to go around, and we call that kind of low per insect resource availability. And what we found was in every trial, when we'd removed those long-tongued bumblebees from the flat patches of flowers, the nectar increased significantly in the flowers. So there was a lot of nectar there. But we found that in earlier summer and also in the autumn, we weren't seeing an increase in honeybees on the flowers. So there didn't seem to be any ecological release from competition. It didn't seem like the honeybees needed that nectar. But then in the late summer, so in July and August, we found that removing the bumblebees caused this increase in nectar, but it also caused a significant increase in honeybee numbers. So suddenly there were loads of honeybees foraging on the flowers, and you could see it. You looked at a patch, the bumblebee excluded patch, and it'd be covered in honeybees. So it seemed like there was this, ecological release from competition. The honeybees would be there. They did need the nectar, and we saw that in 5 out of our trials.
So incorporating that seasonal variability is a really interesting aspect to add to this question. So you found that this resource was more important to honeybees in the later part of the season. Do you know anything about, what other flowers are in bloom during that time, or why maybe this was such a critical period for them?
So that's a really, really good question. And it was one of the most interesting things to come out of this research. It's another piece of a jigsaw that we're seeing in the UK. And I'd have to put the caveat in that this was in the south east UK. So it might not necessarily apply to everywhere where, find different flowers in different regions of the country. But in this particular region, it seems like July and August is a particularly challenging time for bees. So we also had some research in our lab where we showed that honeybees, we used waggle dance decoding to show that honeybees were foraging a lot further in the summer to collect the resource that they need. So it adds this element which shows that there's also a stronger competition for the flowers that are available in the later summer. In the UK, we've seen a lot of over, I guess, probably 100, 150 years, we've seen a big decrease in the amount of arable weeds that are available for bees and insects. And that wasn't necessarily recognized until kind of like the mid 1900s. And then suddenly everyone realized that a lot of the changes in agricultural practices to make things more efficient after World War II had meant that basically lots of weeds and flowering hedges and flowering trees were kind of cleared out of the landscape. And because most of the flowers that come into bloom in the late summer months, so July and August, is herbaceous flowers rather than trees or shrubs, that means that a lot of the flowers that have been removed from the landscape were those which would have come into bloom in July and August. So that's potentially a reason why there's a potential scarcity of resource at that time of year. And at the same time, a lot of insects have their peak flight period at that time of year. So a lot of not just bees, but hoverflies, butterflies will be on the wing in July and August. So there's less food to go around.
So we've got this kind of perfect storm in late summer where you have lots of insects emerging, and at the same time, you have potentially historically less flowers than would be present in the landscape during that time.
Exactly.
So what kind of putting all this picture together, what can we learn that would help us better conserve insects in the UK or, in North America?
Well, in the UK, definitely. And I guess in North America too, although obviously I know less about it. The message for conservation that I always tell to people is just to plant more flowers, and that's not a simple thing, but it is something that everybody can get involved with, whether it's on your balcony or in a pot or, out in your school or wherever you are. Everybody can plant more flowers, and all those flowers will add to what's available for insects. But the particular seasonal variation of it, I suppose, is useful for policy in terms of when we plant things like agri-environment measures to help bees in farmland, or the kind of species that we use to plant and when we plant them to make sure there's enough, particularly at that time of year.
Got it. So taking that individual action of just planting what flowers you can, but also trying to, as a society, organize bloom during the periods that scientific research has shown us are the most stressful for pollinators.
Yeah, and not just planting, but also allowing flowers to grow. So, I don't know for you how it is, but here we seem to have an obsession with mowing, not just in our gardens, but on road verges and in public green space. Mowers out all the time. And actually, you could be allowing clover to grow. That would be a really good resource at that time of year. And if we all recognize that there's not only a need to provide more flowers for insects, many of which are struggling, but also, particularly in the summer, like everyone likes a nice green lawn, but also we kind of need more flowers. So maybe there's a good balance to reach somewhere.
Well, I think that's a great sentiment. And so we're going to take our first break, and we'll be back in just a moment. So welcome back. Moving right along, I think something that's probably on a lot of our listeners' minds right now is that honeybees are native to England, but they are not native to North America. So how do you think that honeybee presence is impacting the native bees of North America? Or what do you think might have been different about this experiment if you had conducted it with lavender in the United States?
Well, I mean, this is probably closer to your research than mine, I guess. So maybe you can help me along. But I suppose any introduction of a non-native species has potential to have more of an impact on the native species because they haven't had all those millennia to co-evolve and to adapt and flexibly create their communities' foraging patterns so that there's this kind of adaptive partitioning of resources. So there is potential there for honeybees to have more of a negative impact, but I want to tread really cautiously because I don't know enough about it. And it's probably, it is also definitely something that's very difficult to show in research, as I'm sure you know. But there has been some research to show, particularly has a really great, interesting study showing that the amount of resource that the non-native honeybees take out of the environment. So this particular study looks at pollen, and they found that over 1 month, honeybees pastured on wildlands when they're not being used for pollination purposes and they're in a kind of downtime to get some forage, they can take enough pollen out of the environment that would lead to 33,000 average sized progeny of native wild bees. So you can see there that honeybees are taking a lot of pollen to their hives, which then isn't available for native bees. So there definitely is this potential to have a detrimental impact. But I suppose it comes back to what I was saying before, which is that none of this would be a problem if there was enough flowers around. You know, it's not necessarily the honeybee's fault or the beekeeper's fault or anything like that. It's just a situation where we need to make sure all insects are being supported, I guess.
No, I think that's a really interesting point because, honeybees obviously are social, just like bumblebees. And so they're, going to provision like large brood nests. But a really missing piece of this question seems to be, to me, like, when is that hitting? Is that hitting during a time when we have a high level of competition, when, native bees are really already looking for resources? Or is that hitting during a time when there's plenty of resources all around? And it doesn't, we could even have more bees in the environment and there would be plenty of flowers to feed them. And so I think that timing aspect is really something that's interesting that could be resolved in the future.
Timing and also location. Are you in a place where there's monoculture agriculture and you aren't necessarily having enough wildflowers around to support insects, or are you in a place where there is a lot of natural pasture? So it depends on whereabouts you are as well, I suppose.
No, that's a great point, especially because a lot of native bees here in North America, the solitary ones at least, usually have pretty short flight distances. So if you don't have an area where the native bees if they haven't been there historically, then there's nothing to compete with, right? Because how are they going to get there?
Yeah. Compared to a honeybee flying up to 12 kilometers a time if it needs to. Yeah.
Yeah. The diversity of pollinators and insects in general is astounding.
Yeah. I suppose there's also, it's interesting to think about per hive how much a colony can take out of the environment. So there's that Tom Seeley study which showed that one strong honeybee colony over a foraging season takes in about 120 kilograms of pollen. Just to put that into a kind of figure that you can almost imagine, 120 kilograms of nectar, and 20 kilograms of pollen, which is just so much, like one hive.
Yeah, to feed all of those hardworking insects that are like doing all of that agricultural labor, yeah, I'd be hungry too. I get it. So what's next for you? So can you tell us a little bit about where you are in your career and then kind of where you're moving to and what questions about competition or bees in general you're excited to start answering next?
So I guess I'll answer those separately, starting with the second bit. So in terms of questions about competition, like with so many other people, I got to the end of my research and just had so many more questions than I did answers. So I'd love to do what I'd done before, but to also look at pollen, for example. We chose to focus on nectar, but I'd love to look at pollen removal and see how that's affecting the whole dynamics of competition. I'd also love to do more studies on a gradient of floral resource availability. So study competition in a place where where you can do a really thorough assessment of the floral resources that are available, and choose a kind of gradient so you can see how that particular factor is affecting the strength of competition, which is really difficult to do. And yeah, like we were saying before, I'd need a lot of people tapping bees in a field with me, which would be really difficult but really interesting. I'd love to look at it in urban centres compared to kind of urban suburbs where there's a lot more flowers, and also in rural landscapes. And yeah, I think there's a lot of questions to answer. I also think it would be really cool to look at how physical presence affects competition. So, a bumblebee and a honeybee, they're also really big. And is there any effect of their physical presence on the flower that causes other species to potentially be displaced in that way? I've never done any research on that. I think there's a small amount of it, but I think it would be really interesting to somehow work out a way of investigating that as well.
So like the idea that like a bumblebee is just so massive that it might be like really intimidating to something like a small osmia who just like flies by and is like, nope, not even gonna try, not even gonna mess with it.
Well, you've probably seen, right, a big kind of fuzzy bumblebee lands on a flower and everything else just leaves.
Yeah.
And it's not because there's any aggression there. It's just because it's really big. I don't know. I mean, is there something there? I've got no idea. I would love to look at it. But in terms of your question, what's next for me? I'm starting a different chapter, and I'm starting a new job next week actually as a climate action researcher. So I'm sort of moving away from pollinators for a bit, but I don't think it's forever. So we'll have to see what happens.
That's awesome. Well, you know, pollinators definitely need questions answered about climate action. That's something that impacts all of us, from, you know, bumblebee to polar bear. So definitely still like contributing to the cause in that way. Great. Well, thank you so much. We are going to take our final break. And when we come back, we will have a couple fun questions for you to answer. All right, welcome back. And we are excited to ask Veronica our last couple fun pollinator questions that we always like to ask every guest on pollination. So first up, what is a pollinator book recommendation that you have for our listeners?
Okay, so this is a book that I haven't read yet, but I know it's going to be amazing. I'm really looking forward to it. And I was given it when I finished my PhD. So it's called Pollinators and Pollination, and it's by Jeff Ollerton.
That's awesome. What excites you about it?
I suppose I actually just think the world of Professor Ollerton, that he's an amazing researcher. I love what he does, and I'm just really excited to know more. His research is really interesting, and I'm sure it's going to be an amazing book.
That's awesome. Okay, so next up, what is your go-to tool for the kind of work that you do?
It's going to have to be the bamboo cane.
All right, give us specifics, like thick, thin, you know, how.
So it's got to be quite long.
Okay.
And you want a nice kind of grippable texture. I don't know. The other thing I would say is essential to any kind of research where you're looking at floral rewards is microcapillary tubes to look at nectar.
Oh,
which,
cool. I
got really good at selecting the right size for the right flower, and just couldn't do without those.
Awesome. Okay, so then our last question for you. What is your favorite pollinator species?
So there's a little bee in the UK, which is our only blue bee, has a blue metallic sheen, and it excavates its nest in bramble stems. And it's called Ceratina cyanea. I always call it the blue bramblebee. And it's not common. I don't think it's massively rare, but when I see it, it's always just like, an absolute treat to see. I really love it.
That's awesome. Cool. Do you have, so you might see this bee in like backyards or more like agricultural places, or?
Well, that takes me to bramble promoting, which is one of my favorite things to do. But I'm sure you know wild bramble blackberry plants. I guess we would call them underrated. But they're a really, really important resource for pollinators, as well as giving you delicious blackberries in the autumn. And bees love to nest in there. So I hope you could find this bee anywhere you find brambles. So the answer to that is don't cut your brambles down. Let them flourish, and hopefully you'll have the pleasure of seeing this tiny bee.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a treat to hear about your work and to get a international perspective on pollinators and competition. Certainly a treat for us and all of our listeners. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah,
thank you so much for having me on. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.